guys, Shanshan here, the artist from Shanshan.co, and I do specials on eBay. Today I'm going to do a movie review of Operation Finale. So Operation Finale is the story of Adolf Eichmann, who is one of the top leaders in Nazi Germany, who orchestrated basically the final solution. He's pretty high up there in the ranks, and so he basically organized some of the early, first gassing by truck, taking around people inside of packed trucks, gassing them. Later they moved on to, in the Eastern Front, hoarding people into a forest, into their own graves, and then shoot them in a mass grave. And then of course later it became the camps, the labor camps, and then more industrialized version of killing people. So this is, one of the architects of the final solution. So he was one of the top guys. So this story is of, the Israelis discover, they thought he'd been lost. They didn't know where he was. They were obviously looking for him, but kind of passively, because they had a lot of their own issues with, the trouble stirring around all their neighbors in the Middle East, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, obviously, Iran, Syria, Iraq, and all those guys didn't like Egypt. They all didn't like Israel. So that was kind of a bigger fish to fry at the time after they got settled in Israel. But so this kind of back burner issue came up. Hey, we found this guy, we think. And they're like, really? And they're like, well, we'll send one guy, see what happens. And they scouted out, and turns out this young girl who was, she was a teen, young 20-year-old girl, and she kind of started, she was at the movies and she runs into this guy. They go on a couple dates, and then it turns out, he takes her to this party, right? And the party happens to be a secret Nazi party, which she didn't know about. And later she knows, she finds out she's actually Jewish. So she's like, oh my gosh, these guys, these guys are maybe, they're up to some bad stuff. And, that information finds its way to the Israeli government. They're like, oh my God, this is Adolf Eichmann. This guy helped kill 6 million of the Jewish people. So basically, they figure out, they kind of do this little spy network to, they get fake passports, they fly over a different world, they end up in Argentina, they figure out a plan how to capture this guy, right, and bring him to justice. So that's all history, so I'm not really giving away the plot, so to say. What I will say is, the story has really good costumes, for the era. They really capture that really well, so it gives a real flavor of 1960 when this guy's caught in Argentina. It's played by some really great actors. You have Ben Kingsley. Obviously, we know him from Gandhi, and also in Schindler's List, he played, the top Jew, second in command. That was his kind of this Jewish guy who got saved by Schindler. And so now he's actually playing Eichmann. So it's like, oh my God, he's gone from Gandhi to Eichmann. You're like, how do you do that? The actor actually talks about that in the sense that when, he played the part of Gandhi, for example, he just let the whole character really soak into his soul because it's such a positive, influential character in history. Now, he said it was a challenge with Eichmann because he wanted to really figure out how to portray him really well and accurately, but at the same time he didn't want it to enter his soul. So he said he figured out a way to do that. Maybe to do him accurately, I think you would have to get really into kind of the darkness of it, and they did somewhat. I will say they had kind of flashbacks to the war periods where you see Eichmann going to one of the mass grave sighting. They show a little bit of him, but they don't kind of do a flash thing of history by using little points and stuff, which is interesting. I really think they could have given maybe 5-10 minutes more in the film to really, flesh out the Eichmann character of his earlier stages and what he actually did, and maybe even his escape route, because what I did on research for this film, I found out not only did he escape, but there were people that helped him escape. The amazing thing is some of these people were connected to the Vatican, right? The Vatican actually, there's this whole operation called rat lines, and it was, basically the rats escaping, right? Hence the name rat lines. And a lot of them pretended to be like Jews, and Eichmann actually tried to pretend that he was a Jew escaping Germany to Argentina, right? That was his cover, and he adopted a new name. And he first didn't go to Argentina. He actually went to Austria. And then they were trying to track him down in Austria, and they actually shot the wrong guy. It was a Nazi, and Eichmann figured out they were onto him, and then he fled to Argentina. So they kind of set the stage there a little bit, so you get a little flavor of, who they're looking for, right? They do have this really nice personalization of the Holocaust. So if you look at other films, say Schindler's List, it's really, there's a couple of personalization stories there, but he's really trying to capture the real essence of Auschwitz, the camp system and how horrific it was, and the lack of justice and just totally arbitrary killing, which was really spectacularly done in that film. I think Spielberg did a really excellent job of that. He cried his eyes out doing that film, which is obviously horrible, covering the Holocaust in that depth of a level. This is more of a, he just does kind of a personal snippets of the story, which is really interesting in the sense that You have this one lead character played by Isaac Oscar, I think his name is, and he played the Star Wars stuff, but he's also done some really great independent film, like The Promise was another great film I reviewed. But anyway, he's this character, and he's one of the lead hunters of this guy, and he's the one that convinces this guy to sign a paper saying that he's going to go to Israel voluntarily, which is kind of crazy. Like, why would they need this paper? But you know, maybe that was just how it worked out back in the day. But that's kind of interesting. And I kind of get why, because the airline AL, they would have gone under, you know, if they probably this would have come to light, like they helped war criminal capture. It's kind of like, are you a public airline? You're not a public airline. I don't know, probably the Israeli government would have bailed them out anyway. So to me, it doesn't seem like an issue, but I think maybe it was possibly an issue during the day. I don't know, maybe they just threw it in there for the film elements, not for sure. But they had this personalization of the Holocaust in the sense that, you know, Oscar Isaac, he's the lead hunter of this guy, and they just show his personal story of his sister and her 3 sons that gets captured by the Nazis. And of course, you know, being the ones that escaped and actually survived, no one really knows how they died, right? Because there were so many people killed that it was just, you know, you escaped, you might have been your only person in the village that survived. And, you know, sometimes you knew the story, like you knew it was in the vans or you knew it was in ditches, but sometimes you really don't know. You just fled, escaped, and then they never heard of it again. You know, they were killed, but you just don't know how. You know, that's maybe why you fled in the first place. You found out they were dying. So they had this real personalization of that, and they also have this really nice part in the film where he has kind of this flashback, you know, where they caught the guy and he's, you know, and it's really kind of like a funeral moment. It's like, whoa, man. And they really do it really well because they go to complete silence in the film, and then you're just like, oh, man. It really grabs you, know. The other film that did that recently was A Quiet Place, which is just a silly monster movie, right? And they did a really good job of different levels of quietness. You know, the music, would be no music, but the people would still be talking or walking. Or there was no sound at all because there was a deaf girl, and it was just fabulous, you know, because it was such a great way to capture the story. Like, this deaf girl doesn't even know the monsters around her, the sound she's making that could actually get her captured, right? So, but in this case, they're using silence as, you know, a moment of silence, you know, and they actually have this pause in the movie, and the guy's just thinking about it. It's like, whoa, it's so momentous, you know, kind of hits you like a stack of books then, you know. So it's a really, I think, a really poignant part of the film. So a lot of the, you know, fortunately, because they are skimming this really character of just Eichmann, it's getting me again, but they're just doing the story of Eichmann. So when they do show the Nazis like rounding up people, they show you kind of the little bit of traces of the Holocaust, of what happened to the Jewish people. They kind of show the Germans as kind of the soldiers and they're just doing their duty, and which is kind of what happened. You know, they really were just following orders from these top guys. Some of them were really diehard Nazis, but others were just soldiers, and then they just happened to get involved in these killing camps. But the interesting thing, if you've read other books on it, I think there's this Willing Executioners, I can't remember the name right now, but it's a really excellent book. And in this book, they cover how they show the duplicity of how, you know, you would be a soldier on the front, but if you really didn't want to kill Jews, you were excused from this. So there was always the possibility to back down and say, it's just too gruesome for me. I can't kill Jews. I'll fight for my country, but I won't kill Jews. So in this book, they really make the argument that there are willing executioners, you know. And there was another book, obviously, on the connection with IBM, and, you know, IBM sold all the computers that tracked the Holocaust, which, you know, allowed us to know the actual number count, you know, 6 million Jews, 10 million complete other people, because they targeted other minorities. So in a way, it's like, you know, IBM was complicit, but on the other hand, it's like, you know, the Germans pulled the trigger, right? The computer doesn't, unless it's AI and you're talking about Terminator. At that point, it's just like simple calculating machines, right? You're really just registering. It allows you to keep track of people, and definitely led to probably more deaths. So there is some probably responsibility there. The interesting part is Eichmann in Argentina, he's working for Mercedes, right? And obviously Mercedes was involved in a lot of war material. They probably, I don't know exactly what they built, but, you know, they built obviously cars during the war, Jeeps, that kind of thing. And, you know, probably even tanks. They're probably converted to building tanks, obviously, and other military machinery that was used in the war to kill people. You know, maybe even the vans to drive around and kill all these people. So, you know, it's kind of like this, like, you know, it's like it's after the war, but they're not really. How's this guy working in Mercedes and they're not finding out about it? So that's pretty disturbing if you think about it. A lot of Jews felt guilty about it, especially the second generation. And even the third generation is really a lot of guilt. And I lived in Germany, so I can really say that. And I saw that, you know, like people, you know, they had these, you they had this really deep sense of responsibility that they really need to wash themselves clean of that and never allow it to happen. So they were, the Boy Scouts have been wiped out because they were taken over by the Hitler Youth during the war. And so now there's no Boy Scouts, which is really awful because Boy Scouts, like I went in the Boy Scouts and it was really a great experience, I think, as a youth. But there's other really creepy stories. Like I worked for a German family and they were well-to-do, they were upper middle class, and they had done well. And my wife was the au pair for them, watching the kids and all this. And then I did that for a while, right? Before I got a job, I was just babysitting. They had these antiques around the house, like this old sewing machine and everything. And you're like, and then he's like, oh yeah, it's from my grandma. And you're like, was it really from your grandma? Because the thing is, her grandfather was actually a police officer during the German Nazi period. If you're a German police officer during the Nazi period, you might have some more loot. Of course, everyone did everything they could to survive during the war too, because at the end of the war, the Germans were starving. But up until that point, they had been bleeding all of Europe for all the resources. So the Germans lived really well in the war until the last year. They were being bombed, but they were still being well supplied and well fed. But part of it was because they were robbing people and they were robbing whole economies. It was a pretty vicious machinery of the Nazi government. So I think they covered the story well, as much as they could in 2 hours. I kind of wish they had done more on the backstory of Adolf Eichmann. They skimmed over it again, like I said, but you really don't get the sense of his true sense of villainy. I mean, they tried to do a couple scenes, and the scenes are representational, which I think those scenes are good. But there could have been more, like maybe meetings with Hitler and how they decided to get to the vans, and then they get to the trenches, and then they got to the camp system. They don't really show those connections with Eichmann. Obviously, most of us are pretty well kind of a historian of Holocaust, or there's easily readable material, so you can dive into this and have a quick feel for it, or maybe even met people that went through I've met people that went through the camps, and it's like, holy crap. Like, I know this woman, her sister actually has a bar of soap from the camps, and that's made of human fat. And she kept it because she wants to have that proof, hey, this really existed. People don't want to believe, but this really is here. And so they capture that. They could have been better. I guess 2 hours is getting long, so you have to make your choices, right? You gotta choose your battles to fight. So they kind of skipped on that. That could have made it a little better, I think, to make him more than just this guy they're going after, right? Another part they really captured well was kind of this Nazi German sympathizers that were in Argentina. And I've actually had Argentine and Chilean friends, and it's a running joke in those countries about how these Nazis escaped, and they were actually living there in the sense that they knew their governments were kind of sympathetic. Like Perón in Argentina in the 40s, he was actually sympathetic with these Nazis escaping, because there was this old German immigrant. There are a lot of German immigrants in Argentina. It's mostly German or Italian if you go down there. And so some of the Germans were very sympathetic towards the Nazi party, and they were supportive of these people, and that's how this guy was actually able to live. So they actually show these guys kind of trying to reconfigure and saying, hey, we got to lay low, we're eventually going to rise again, and so it has this really creepy undertone of, hey, the fascists might rise again. And in a country like that, it's a possibility in the sense that, Argentina does have a huge German population, and they're going on the extreme from socialism to fascism, kind of back and forth in their government. So there was a real danger that, you had some of these tendencies. As you know, in Chile and in Argentina, there was, kind of dictator type of governments where they rounded up people and just randomly killed them. And it was for political purposes. So, kind of like it's a repetition happening. Again, comparing this film to other, outside of even a bigger realm, say The Promise, which also covers the Armenian genocide. And I think that film really covered it well, in the sense that you come from the beginning of the war, where you see kind of this animosities between Turkish and Armenians, who had been sprinkled all through the Turkish Empire. And so they were a pretty big population, and were seen by the Turkish as a possible threat to overthrow the government. As the Turkish Empire was being chewed up, they lost the war in the World War I, and Great Britain, France, they really decided, hey, we're going to screw these guys over, and we chopped their empire. They gave Iraq away, they gave Syria away, they gave part of Saudi Arabia away. And so the Turkish were really bitter, and so when they were forced back into Turkey, they actually turned upon the Armenians, who kind of wanted to form their own state as well. And Armenians are spread all over Turkey, so if they would have really split, it could have been 1/3 of Turkey against split off into Armenians. So they were totally against this. And so that film is really great as well. And I think they captured the genocide better from the beginning of the story all the way to the end where they barely escape with their lives. So this one kind of skims the surface. You just see little stories, glimpses. It's another way to cover the Holocaust, so it's a very interesting approach. It's a lighter version of the Holocaust, so more digestible, I would say, for a younger audience, and it is rated PG-13. So I think, the further we get out, the more people have time to think about it and do kind of these side stories, like first you had to do stories like Schindler's List, or like I think Sophie's List was another one, and there's all these other stories which are really deep in the meat of the Holocaust, and these are more like the very fringe of the Holocaust, so they're kind of covering the rest of this. They did another film I think earlier in the year, but I skipped it because I've seen a lot, so it's a lot to take in sometimes, but this story just seemed to capture a lot of interest in the sense that, wow, they're going for one of the top leaders of the Nazi regime, and he had escaped all the way to Argentina, which is crazy. That's half a world away. So I think they cover that story pretty well. I wish they would have had kind of a little bit more on the meat of the story of him escaping and how they were closing it. They did that a little bit, and they showed a little bit of scenes from Austria, but they could have made that, I think, a little more interesting and how dicey it was for Eichmann to kind of escape. But again, they can only cover 2 hours, and most of the story is from they find out it's him and they bring him to justice, so that's kind of a complete story in itself. So there's only so much backstory you can go into, but again, I recommend it. It really, obviously it's tearjerker, with being the Holocaust and, related to the Holocaust. The one thing I think I might have changed is, like when they did Argo, and Argo's a story of these Americans, they were captured by the Iranians, but there was a small group of them that escaped to the Canadian embassy, and they were hiding out, and they were trying to figure out a way to get these guys to escape, and they smuggled them out through the airplane and got them out all the way to Canada and then back to the US, obviously. And that was a great blow to the Iranian regime. So in that film, they really capture really well the fear of how the society is just crumbling and going to this fear regime. So in this film, I don't think they really captured the sense of the fear that was in the Nazi regime. They do a little bit as far as the German sympathizers that are in Argentina, and they're forming this Nazi group and they might come to power. That they are forming really well, and that they capture really well the essence of how someone can be like, oh, I don't like these people, I hate these people, let's form a group, and then they start doing all the Nazi propaganda and marching. They're really starting to step up, and you can see how it progressively gets worse over time. And basically kind of how the Nazis, an analogy, kind of how they formed in Germany as well. They started as small rallies, small speeches in the Munich area, in these beer things, and people do these crazy speeches by Hitler and all these other people, and then eventually they just coalesced into a group. They took over the government, and then they just started amassing this massive amount of power, and all based on fear, right? So you can see that when they do this movie on the Argentinian side, it's really interesting covering that aspect. I think they did it really well, especially the haircuts. And the scary thing is, if you look at nowadays, a lot of forgive me if I say this, but a lot of Asian haircuts, they actually are cutting. I mean, I have a short haircut as well, so but anyway, they have this shaved heads and then this high top. And that's a reminiscent exactly to the 30s haircut, related to like kind of fascism, It's also related to just the 30s haircut, right? It's not necessarily per se fascist, but it's so related to that, theme. You're just like, you're like, what are you guys foreshadowing, It's like, are you foreshadowing this horrible fascist regime? And then you see this guy, Xi Jinping, and he's becoming a dictator for life now, and you're like, oh man, they're gonna start the purges. And you can already see it with the Uyghurs. They're rounding them up, doing religious education, Tibet's, obviously they're harassing the hell out of them. And it's starting to move towards the Han, and they're starting to move towards Hong Kong and starting to crush down the democracy in Hong Kong and the freedoms there. Well, they're not really democratic, but they have some of the respectability of the freedoms of a democratic society, and that's slowly getting crushed, And then Beijing, all these big cities are starting to go against their own population as well. So it's just going to get nastier and nastier. It's kind of the nature of a dictatorship. You start in one peaceful way, and then to maintain power, you have to constantly pound down. Man, you can see it coming out in China, and I don't think people living there are maybe seeing that. They're saying, oh, there's all these people are nice, and yeah, the majority of the population is nice, but if you got some maniacs in power, and then really bad things are allowed to happen in the street, like just straight up racism, straight up lynch mob mentalities, like, I don't know, it could be really ugly down the line, right? So I wouldn't encourage people to go to China to live. To visit maybe, but I don't think it's going to be entering a good period in the short future. I think it's going to be pretty ugly. But yeah, I really highly recommend this film. Gives you a little insight into how a fascist kind of rises, at least in Argentina's sense. And so that gives it a little flavor of, because they're capturing the tail end of the World War II. So at that point, it's just fact. You know, they've already rounded up people, they've already captured people, people are demoralized. They've kind of almost accepted their fate that they're going to be killed by these Nazi soldiers. So it has a different afflict. But they, you know, Ben Kingsley, like the character really resides around him in the sense that he has to really capture Eichmann. I think he does a pretty good job. He lets some things slide that really are true to that character. I think, you know, just the lack of culpability. Like, oh, we're just following orders. We're part of this huge machine, and which is true in a sense. But if you're the top guy, you know, it's hard to say. But if you've read other books, there's another book I read about the ambassador of the American ambassador living in Germany, in Berlin, and his daughter who dates an SS guy, and it's crazy because you can see the level of fear growing over time. And these guys have diplomatic immunity, right? They're Americans living there. Americans are seen as, you know, a lot of have German blood. So, you know, I would pass for German. When I lived in Germany, I looked German. People would come and speak to me straight away in German because I have some German blood, and I pass German. But yeah, so that's, you know, really kind of scary how quickly society kind of, you know, evolves into that. So I think this is a really nice snippet of the Holocaust, and a really great way to introduce, say, a young kid to the Holocaust without being so dramatic about it. It's a nice, important story, and you see, you know, they have this really, the moment of silence in the film is just like, wow, it just hits you like a ton of books, you know. It's a really, really good moment. But yeah, I recommend it, and hope you guys like my review, and see you next week.